Welcome to Psydactic, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Board Study Edition. I'm your host, Dr. O'Leary, a Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast that I designed to help myself and other CAPS fellows study for their boards. But anyone interested in human development, mental health, children at all will likely get something out of this. Now, for a rundown on how it's produced, please see episode 1. I say this because I'm using AI to assist me with the content creation, and I explain some of this in episode 1. Despite the fact that I am using AI to assist me, all the content in this podcast should be considered to be my personal opinion and no one else's. If you find errors in the content, I would love it if you would just go to psydactic.com, that's psydactic.com, and fill out a form there and let me know. Today I want to talk about something that has been really influential in child and adolescent psychiatry and in general in psychology for the last 100 years. And it's called attachment theory. And the first person to really look into this was John Bowlby. Now, he was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and he became really dissatisfied with his own psychoanalytic training. He thought that there was way more to know. Bowlby's son, Richard, has reported that his father was criticized by his training psychoanalysts for questioning their ideas and their methods, and was told that his problem was that he just didn't understand it. If he could get to the point that he understood psychoanalysis, then he would see his own ignorance. Now, Bowlby was not satisfied with statements like this. Instead, he decided to take a huge risk, and that was to attempt to actually test some of the psychological ideas out there by gathering huge amounts of observational data, including talking to whole families instead of just individuals, which is something psychoanalysts at the time just did not do. He then did what was also radical at the time, and that was to try to make a model that fit this data, instead of what psychoanalysts did, which was to fit the data they were gathering to their analytic models. And for this, he was criticized by great figures like Melanie Klein and Anna Freud. Now, while he reportedly always considered himself to be an object relations theorist, his work went far beyond what his predecessors could ever have achieved by merely refining their own ideas, by thinking about them more. Bowlby was able to accomplish this by careful observation and by surrounding himself with thinkers like Mary Ainsworth, who insisted that they remain skeptical of their own ideas and continue to gather more data, even when they feel very certain. Bowlby's incorporation of a more scientific skepticism and his partnership with Mary Ainsworth allowed them to develop what has become one of the most useful and persistent paradigms in child development. That paradigm is attachment theory. Let's get started with John Bowlby. John Bowlby posited that infants, because they're biological beings, are predisposed, due to evolutionary pressures, to form strong emotional bonds with their primary caregivers. This is because these bonds, which came to be known as attachments, are necessary for survival at the basis, and also for a child's emotional, social, and cognitive development. There are some words I want to discuss that Bowlby talked about, because each of these sort of captures part of his theory. Now, Bowlby believed that infants form a primary attachment bond with only one primary caregiver. It's typically the mother. This is called monotropy. This monotropic bond is considered crucial for healthy development in Bowlby's conceptualization of attachment. He also proposed that there is a critical period. Now, the critical period is within the first 2 years of life, and this is when attachment bonds form the most easily, and the primary bond forms. If attachment is disrupted during the critical period, something you could call maternal deprivation, it has permanent negative consequences for the child. You can't undo it. Next, Bowlby believed in what are called internal working models. This is similar to the objects, like in object relations, right? Early attachments shape a child's models, and then these models are representations later of themselves and of others. So he thought that this model formed by attachment affected everything, the child's view of themselves and the child's view of other people. He also talks about something called a secure base behavior. A secure attachment provides a safe base from which a child can explore the world. And I've talked about something similar when I was talking about object relations before. If the child knows that their caregiver is available for support and for comfort, then they have secure base behavior. And then there's also something else called separation anxiety. And this isn't a pathological or bad thing, it's a normal thing. So when a child is separated from that primary caregiver, especially, they experience separation anxiety. And it's a normal and adaptive response to the threat of separation. So I'm going to go into this separation anxiety a little bit more. And then later I'm going to talk about Mary Ainsworth's strange situation, which looks at separation anxiety and tries to use that to identify different attachment styles. But first, let's look at separation anxiety. John Bowlby identified 3 progressive stages of distress that young children will experience when separated from their primary caregiver. The first is protest. So this is intense distress. They'll scream, cry. They will maybe hit whoever has them at the time when the caregiver leaves. They're in a lot of distress. If they can, as the caregiver is leaving and they realize this, they'll cling to the caregiver to try to prevent them from leaving. During the protest stage, they're going to refuse all comfort. No one's going to be able to calm them down. It's just something they have to do. The next stage is called despair. The protests subside. They appear to calm down, but also kind of withdraw. They may lose interest in activities and become less responsive to others. I mean, they might even seem hopeless. Despair kind of looks a lot like what we describe some of the features of depression as being, and some people think that this process is the same as what is involved in depression when people develop it later in life. After despair comes detachment. So detachment is when a child begins to engage with other caregivers. They increase their interest in other people other than their primary caregiver. And for this, they need to experience an emotional detachment. They have to emotionally detach from the primary caregiver, from their expectations of that primary caregiver being there. And if you're an analyst, you'd say that they're repressing their feelings about their mother in order to achieve this emotional detachment. The new relationships that they form during detachment are initially very superficial and they lack depth, especially the depth of the original attachment. Nothing can ever get that close. Children don't necessarily go through all of these stages in the same way, or even all of them. Some kids just kind of get over it pretty fast, or they don't notice too much. But these are considered the normal or most typical way that children react when their primary caregiver is taken away. And if they don't react in these stages at all, then that's something suspicious. Now, I've talked about what happens when you break an attachment, when you take someone away from their attached figure, but how do you develop an attachment? Bowlby thought that there were basically 4 phases you could go through to develop an attachment. One is the pre-attachment phase, from about birth to 6 weeks, and this is also known as undiscriminating social responsiveness. So an infant is just crying and doing other things, and it doesn't matter who responds. Anyone can respond, and they will accept comfort and food and care from anyone. It's undiscriminating social responsiveness. And after around 6 weeks to between 6 and 8 months is the attachment in the making phase. So this is where they're starting to form the attachment. It's also called the discriminating social responsiveness phase. So infants begin to differentiate between familiar and unfamiliar people, and they show a high preference for the primary caregiver. They appear to develop a sense of trust, and they have expectations about their caregiver's responsiveness and what they can get from them. So this is from 6 weeks to around 6 to 8 months, and that's the discriminating social responsiveness phase, where you have an attachment in the making. By around 6 to 8 months, there is a clear-cut attachment process. It's also called active proximity seeking, as it describes the child's behavior. So once infants have formed strong attachments to their primary caregiver, they exhibit that separation anxiety that I talked about, and they seek proximity to the caregiver for comfort and for security. They don't want to be away from the caregiver for too long. Even if they're in the same room, they'll go back every now and then and just check in. The fourth and last phase is called goal-corrected partnership phase, and this is basically a mature attachment phase. So children have developed kind of a more sophisticated understanding of relationships in general. They have a need for closeness, but they also have a need for independence, and they can balance this better. And so stuff like this actually requires something called the theory of mind, because a child needs to be able to see that their caregiver also has needs, not just their needs, and they can compromise with the caregiver to have their own needs met instead of just demanding that their needs are met. So they can see the other caregiver as something that is more separate from them. Another word for this, when you have secure adult attachments, is called detachment. That's when you're able to decouple yourself from others. And you can have deep and loving relationships, but you don't necessarily see yourself as bound to that person in the same way that an infant sees themselves as bound to their primary caregiver. Before I go on to the strange situation, I want to talk about some alternatives to John Bowlby and to Mary Ainsworth. And this is Rudolf, Schaffer, and Peggy, Emerson. So they broke with Bowlby and Ainsworth in a few important ways that I'm going to discuss now. With Bowlby, I talked about something called monotropy, where the primary thing is the primary caregiver, and it's so important nothing else can really happen without that attachment being made. So Bowlby emphasized the importance of a single primary attachment figure, and this is almost always the mother in our society anyway. And he believed that this primary bond was absolutely crucial for a child's emotional and social development. Without it, everything else is going to go bad. Schaffer and Emerson, however, they more broadly defined attachment. So they thought that infants could form multiple attachments with different caregivers. Now, they did observe that infants develop very specific attachments with individuals, especially individuals who are around them, but their attachments are strongest with people who are sensitive and who respond to their needs. So you can form multiple attachments with different individuals as long as each of those individuals appear to understand and be able to respond to your needs. Now, Bowlby proposed that critical period that I was talking about, where if that gets messed up within that period, an attachment or healthy attachments really just can't form. This period is critical for a child's future self. Schaffer and Emerson didn't really support the idea of a critical period. They thought that you can have multiple attachments, but you can also have multiple attachments at different stages of development. So this critical period, while it's important for kids when they're that age to have these secure relationships with others, to have people who are responsive to their needs and who are sensitive to their needs, who can understand what the child wants, it can be multiple different people. It doesn't have to be one person, and they didn't really conceptualize a critical period like Bowlby did. Their phases of attachment, they also have 4 phases, are very, very similar to Bowlby's. So the first, for Schaffer and Emerson, is called the asocial stage, and this is from about 0 to 6 to 8 weeks, just like Bowlby's first stage, which was undiscriminating social responsiveness, as opposed to asocial. And in this stage for Schaffer and Emerson, infants don't really discriminate between people. They'll accept things from anyone. The next stage that they proposed is the indiscriminate attachment phase, which is a little bit different than the discriminating social responsiveness phase. For Schaffer and Emerson, indiscriminate attachment phase is where infants kind of learn that multiple people can provide for their needs. So they'll still have a preference for the most responsive person, but it doesn't have to be one person. The next phase in Schaffer and Emerson's attachment is similar to Bowlby's. It's specific attachment, and it's from about 7 to 9 months, and that's pretty much like the active proximity phase, although the active proximity phase lasts much longer. So Schaffer and Emerson thought that between 7 and 9 months, this is when there's the preference for one primary caregiver becomes very strong. But then after this preference is developed, infants continue to form attachments with other caregivers. So the last phase is after 9 months, and infants can form attachments with siblings, grandparents, fathers, their child care providers, like their nannies or their au pairs. And so it's not so important to have just one primary figure. The others can fill in a lot. So to summarize some of these differences, Bowlby's theory really focused on the importance of that primary attachment figure, the one primary attachment figure, because he was inferring the necessity of this attachment from his speculations about its evolutionary significance. He thought that this had to form in order for creatures to be able to survive in the past, so it was selected for. Not that he had evidence for this, but this was his idea. So like Sigmund Freud, he tried to make his ideas consistent with his assumptions about Darwinian theory. And this included the primacy of that primary attachment. Schaffer and Emerson's research really broadened this perspective because they noted that the primary attachment, while existing and important, was only one of many attachments a child could make. And a child is actually programmed to make multiple attachments, not just one primary attachment, which they use as a model for all the other attachments. They can have independent attachments that aren't necessarily based on that one model that Bowlby proposed. That one object is not the model for every single attachment that a child has. And because of this, they didn't propose this critical period where there must be one primary attachment figure that served as the model for their child. Their view of developing a child's mind was much less bounded by assumptions, you could say. They were more open to embrace a role of multiple attachments because that's what they saw in their research happening to kids. They didn't assume that, these were just based on a single primary attachment. Now, I cannot keep talking about attachment theory without talking about Mary Ainsworth's strange situation and her concept of attachment styles. Mary Ainsworth developed what we call the strange situation, and I'll describe it in a moment. And this is meant to kind of assess an young kiddo's attachment style, so she can measure what they do during this strange situation, and then kind of determine what kind of an attachment style that they have. In the strange situation, kids are typically between about 9 and 18 months old, and they arrive with their primary caregiver, which is usually the mother. The procedure involves 8 different episodes, and they each last about 3 minutes. And the child is exposed to this series of separations and reunions with the caregiver, and sometimes in the presence of a stranger. So here are the episodes of the strange situation. Number 1, the parent and the child are left alone in a playroom. The researcher observes the child's exploratory behavior and their interaction with the parent. So they're looking for things like, will the child separate from the parent, play for a while, then go back and check in with the parent. So parent and child are alone for about 3 minutes. Then a stranger enters. When they enter the room, they attempt to interact with the child, and the researcher is observing the child's response to the stranger. Does the child just retreat from the stranger? Do they kind of look to mom, and see like, what do I do here? What's the kiddo doing? Then the parent leaves and the stranger stays. So the primary caregiver has left the room, and the researchers observe the child's response to that separation. and the stranger attempts to comfort the child. So this is when that separation anxiety is supposed to kick in, and the child's supposed to have those responses like protesting and despair and detachment. Now, this happens for a few minutes, and then the parent returns, and the stranger leaves. So here the researchers are looking at how easily is the child able to be comforted. Are they actually concerned at all that mom came back? I mean, maybe they didn't need comforting. Maybe they didn't care so much that mom left or came back. And that says something about the attachment. And the stranger also leaves the room. So the parent is there with the child alone. The stranger is not there kind of confounding what's happening between the mom and the child, or the primary caregiver and the child. Phase 5 is when the parent leaves the child alone. No one else is in the room. The child's just alone. And the researchers observe the child's response to being alone this second time. So now they've kind of learned that mom left and came back. What's going on here? How do they respond the second time? While they're in the room alone, the stranger comes back in and attempts to comfort the child. And the researchers observe the child's response to that stranger. And then the parent returns and comforts the child. And of course, the researchers are observing what happens here as well. And then the final phase are the parent and the child are alone in the room. And the researchers looking at how the child interacts with the parent and whether or not the child is able to return to play. Are they able to be comforted and to go back to play at this point? Or do they even care at all that any of this happened? That's all information to the researcher. So by observing all of this, Mary Ainsworth proposed that there are, well, at first 3 kinds of attachments, but then later a 4th kind was added. So the first, and you could say most desirable form of attachment is the secure attachment. So this is where a child will seek comfort from their caregiver when they're distressed, but they're pretty easily soothed and they can go back and explore their environment confidently. An insecure avoidant attachment is when children show less distress on separation from their caregiver, and they might actually avoid any contact upon return. There is an avoidance of the caregiver in a way. The third is insecure resistant attachment, also known as anxious ambivalent attachment. So children with insecure resistant attachment, they're clingy, and you could say they're ambivalent toward the caregiver. They resist comfort. They might show anger and distress on separation and at reunion, and they can't be comforted very easily. So they're insecure and resistant to the caregiver. Now that 4th style that was added on later was meant to kind of explain things that just didn't fit into the secure attachment or the insecure avoidant or insecure resistant attachment. And this was called disorganized attachment. So children with a disorganized attachment exhibit it's inconsistent behavior or it's confusing behavior where they don't fit these other molds. They might themselves appear kind of dazed or disoriented, like they don't know what's going on. And so a disorganized attachment is basically like you could say the trash heap for kids who don't fit into the secure or the insecure avoidant or the insecure resistant places. The way an attachment is formed is very important. And Bowlby thought that an attachment is formed in a very predetermined, evolutionarily deep way, where this model is formed in the child's mind, and all other relationships have to be compared to this model, basically. And once that model is formed, it's very resistant to change. Emerson and Schaffer, they weren't really as interested in this model, and they also weren't as interested in the attachment styles that Ainsworth was describing. But they were interested in the process of creating and maintaining attachments themselves. They talked about something called sensitive responsiveness in a caregiver. So this is the ability of the caregiver to basically accurately interpret and to respond to an infant's signals in a way that is timely and appropriate for the infant. So, this sensitive responsiveness, they say, is what creates these healthy attachments, something that Mary Ainsworth would call a secure attachment. So, here's how basically sensitive responsiveness can affect an attachment. The first is by basically building trust and security. So, this is similar to that secure base. When caregivers are sensitive, they're correctly interpreting the infant's cues, such as their cries and their facial expressions and their body language. And that allows them to respond to the infant's needs. So they have to know what the infant needs, right? Be sensitive to it. And then they can respond. And the response has to be timely. It has to be in a meaningful time where the infant can pair that response with whatever cue they were giving. Not that they're giving the cue intentionally, but in their mind, somehow, these two things are associated with each other. So this will convey the message that the infant's needs do matter to the caregiver and they can rely on the caregiver for support. Another super important thing, and this is something that I have to often remind myself about as a parent and help other parents to remember, is consistent responses. So consistent responsiveness results in predictability. You are reliable. The child can predict exactly what's going to happen next. And that helps infants and older children develop trust in you. I mean, even if they don't like the response, if they can predict that it's going to happen, they can adjust their own behavior. So consistency is extremely important. So to build trust and security, you have to be sensitive. You have to have an accurate interpretation. You have to have a timely response. And the response has to be consistent. It has to be similar to your last response. And this all helps to promote emotional regulation. And caregivers can help reinforce this by validating emotions. They can acknowledge that a child is having an emotion, kind of point it out, not just the positive ones, but the negative ones too, and talk about it. Oh, I can see you're angry. What are you angry about? Oh, this makes us very happy. I see you're laughing. And so they get a child to really understand that that caregiver knows what their emotional state is. And this helps them to be able to learn basically coping strategies for their different emotions. Caregivers can help even infants to learn healthy ways to regulate their emotions. They'll offer comfort and even try to distract an infant when they're upset. And this can show an infant that, like, okay, I'm angry, but I can switch. There are other options besides staying angry. My needs are being met. I don't have to stay angry. And caregivers also are models for kids about healthy emotional expression. So if a caregiver gets upset and flies off the handle and is unpredictable, or if the caregiver seems frustrated all the time, or the caregiver is kind of withdrawn and not responsive, that teaches infants in some ways how to act, how to manage their own emotions, what to do when they are experiencing something that they identify as being similar to the caregiver. Now, the last thing I want to hit on here is something called parenting styles, because if sensitive responsiveness affects attachment, the way that parents parent a child then will affect the child's attachment. And there are different parenting styles that have been identified. And I'm going to use a model that includes authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and neglectful. And I'm just using this because it's actually easy to talk about, but also to demonstrate how this can affect a child's attachment, how the environment, the parenting environment, can affect a child's relationship with their attachment figures. The first three styles that I'm going to talk about were first developed in the 1960s by Diana Baumrind, if that's how you pronounce that. I'm sorry, Diana. And then later in the 1980s, Eleanor, Maccoby, and John Martin added the last parenting style, which is the neglectful one. But let's get started with the first three. The first is probably the most desirable parenting style, and it's called authoritative. So authoritative parents are highly responsive, but they're also highly demanding. They demonstrate to a child that they will be there, that they can be counted on, but they also, as a child gets older and older, really demand more and more from that child, more autonomy and more exploration and more achievement from the child. But they're there to support them the whole time. an authoritative parent is monitoring their child. They can see what their state is. They may be highly demanding, but they're supporting the kid the whole time. So what happens is children feel safe and loved and valued, even, when they're struggling, even when they're doing hard things. And the attachment that they have is enduring and secure. They can trust and rely on their caregivers, and they learn that they can trust and rely on themselves, even when they're not feeling very well. They can still accomplish things. And this happens because of authoritative parenting. The next kind of parenting is the authoritarian parenting. And so this is characterized by low responsiveness, but high demandedness. So it's the high demandedness of the authoritative, but with low sensitive responsiveness. They don't see the child's emotional state very well. They try to force the child to do things. They demand that child does stuff, but they're not that supportive of it. They just expect the child to do it for themselves. So this definitely will lead to an insecure, kind of avoidant attachment, is most likely, where the child just avoids the parents if they can. The main thing that this teaches children is that they have to suppress their emotions. They don't cope with their emotions. They have to not have them, because if the parent sees them having those emotions, they're going to be punished for having those emotions. There's a role for suppressing emotions in society, obviously, but when you're an authoritarian parent, that's basically the only thing you teach your kids, is that I can't be vulnerable around mom or dad because I will be punished for that. So this makes it hard for them to develop trust and intimacy in the future. Another type of parenting that at first might seem nice for parents, it might seem like it's a good thing, is called permissive parenting. And in permissive parenting, there's high responsiveness. The parent is there a lot, but there's really low demandingness. So the parent's not demanding that the child do anything. They're not expecting much out of the child, but they're constantly responding to the child's emotions. This can make someone really insecure and anxious. Before, I call this insecure resistant. It's called also anxious ambivalent attachment. These all describe a very similar thing, where children are clingy, they're demanding, and they have a lot of difficulty with self-regulation, and they can't really be easily comforted by their caregivers. And this supposedly results from very permissive parenting, where the parent is very highly responsive, but it's very low in demandingness, low in their expectations of the child. Now, the fourth kind of parenting is called neglectful parenting. And this results from low responsiveness and low demandingness. So basically, they're just not responsive to the child, and they don't expect much of the child. So the child is uninvolved with the parent. The parent is unresponsive to the child's needs. This child will also struggle with emotional regulation. They'll have difficulty forming healthy relationships. They're probably going to exhibit more erratic and kind of confused behavior. So the kinds of behaviors that some person might think of with someone who has borderline personality disorder could result from, according to this model, neglectful parenting. Now, it's really important to note that, these types of parenting are just one way to conceptualize parenting, and they are dependent on a level of what's called responsiveness and a level of what's called demandingness. But we know that life is way more complicated than that, and kids' relationships with their parents and primary caregivers is more complicated than this. But it's definitely useful to use this framework with parents to help to understand, why a child interacts with them in a certain way, why a child has what appears to be a certain attachment style. And the great thing about what Emerson and Schaffer said was, well, actually, you can change these attachment styles by changing your sensitive responsiveness. So you can use a different parenting style, and that can modify the attachment. According to Bowlby, that attachment is far more set in stone and resistant to change if it's not formed well during that critical period. Thanks for hanging out with me today while I talked about attachment and some parenting styles. Next, I want to get into something called temperament, because temperament, unlike an attachment, is something that's built into the child. It's something that supposedly they are born with. And because of their temperament, they may develop certain attachment styles in some ways despite their environment. So while temperament is responsive to the environment, it's also kind of resistant to change. But I'll get into that next time. Until then, I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psydactic Caps Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.